Welcome back to Shattering Myths. We're going to, as we do on all of our programs, turn the page and begin to consider Yahowah's answer to all of the religious and political things that are going awry in the world. His suggestion to us, of course, is to walk away from religion and politics, to not be dependent upon your government, but instead to rely on him. It is good advice. He is reliable. Government is not. Religion is not. And so it is God's instruction to us to consider what he has to say, consider who he is, and then if you're of the mind to get to know him, if you're of the mind to want to engage in a relationship with him, to do so along the lines of the guidance that he has provided. So yesterday we were evaluating a statement that I thought was quite interesting. It begins in Devarim, the 5th chapter. Moshe called out to and invited all of Yisrael. Yisrael means individuals who engage and endure with God, saying and promising, Yisrael, listen to, Shama, the inscribed prescriptions for living. Those inscriptions which were cut into stone that cut you into the covenant relationship, and also listen to the means to exercise good judgment and to resolve disputes, which beneficially I am sharing with you today for you to hear. Then he went on and said, and learn from and teach them these two things. The inscribed prescriptions for living that are contained in the Torah that cut us into the relationship, and the means the Torah provides to resolve disputes, which is the 7th step that we walk to God so that we can enter his home. He encourages us to learn from them. Not to believe them, to learn from them. He then says, the next thing I want you to do here is that in addition to listening to what God has to say, I want you to use your eyes to closely examine and carefully consider these things, these two things, both of which comprise enormous swaths of the Torah. The prescriptions for living that cut us into this relationship and the means God has provided to resolve disputes. Observe them, closely examine and carefully consider them. Now, why would God want you to do that? Because they are his means to not only engage in a relationship with him, but to be saved by that covenant relationship. And so he's saying, the best advice I can give you is to open your eyes, focus on them, pay attention to them, evaluate them, consider them. If you can do that, then you are going to be in a position, and this is the concluding thought of Moshe's statement, so that once you've listened to the means to be cut into the relationship, once you have listened to the means that God has provided to resolve disputes so that we can be perfect and righteous in his eyes, once you've listened to those things, once you've learned from those things, once you've closely examined and carefully considered those things, which are, by the way, presented only in the Torah, then you'll be in a position to approach God by acting upon them. That's the whole story, isn't it? Now, what comes next, though, is equally insightful. What I have been sharing with you is that all of this exists to encourage us to recognize that the entire purpose of the Torah is to introduce the covenant, to share its terms and conditions, to communicate its benefits, and to encourage us, invite us, if you will, to consider it and act upon it. So what is the next statement? Devarim 5:2. Yahowah, God's one and only name, Almighty, established the familial covenant relationship with us in Horeb. These two thoughts go together. This notion of listening to God, especially regarding the prescriptions that have been inscribed that cut us into the relationship, and the means that God has provided to resolve the disputes that would otherwise separate us. Examining and considering them so that we can respond to them is the essence of establishing the covenant. It's the basis upon which the covenant was established. It is the means to participate in the covenant, which is why Yah follows it with these words. Yahowah, Almighty, established, cut, karat, has cut you in on the familial covenant relationship. Bereth, this alliance of friendship, this marriage vow. Bereth is based upon Be'eth, the Hebrew word for family, household, and home. And it was cut with us, with Yisrael, with those of us who engage and endure with God in Horeb. Horeb is a dry and desolate place. It also means knife, sword, and chisel. And so the knife and the sword speak of cutting, forming a division. You're either with God through his covenant by listening to what he has to say about it, by observing what he has communicated regarding it. You're with him based upon what he has to say about how you can engage in it, or you're cut off from him. That's why Horeb is the Hebrew word that speaks of a knife and sword's division. But Horeb is also the Hebrew word for chisel, which is a cutting stone. Remember, the prescriptions for living were engraved. They were inscribed. They were chiseled into stone. The 10 statements that God etched in stone actually present the 5 conditions, the 5 terms that are the requirements, if you will, for participating in the covenant. That's why it was at Horeb. Horeb was a dry and lifeless place until God showed up there, took his people there, and then it became the source of life. It was the place where he chiseled his instructions in stone. It was the place where he inscribed his message to humankind, bringing life to a desolate place. Horeb is also the knife-edged mountain currently in Saudi Arabia, where that is also known as Sinai. And so it is here that, with these words, God once again devastated the religion of Christianity. Yahowah established the covenant, not man, and that would include Abraham, which thereby undermines the central thrust of Galatians, which serves as the foundation for Pauline doctrine. Yahowah cut us in on this alliance in Horeb, which means that God's testimony is in direct conflict with Paul's testimony in Galatians and Romans, whereby the covenant established on Sinai was alleged to be with Hagar, who was nowhere around at the time, and was said to be of the flesh and enslaving. And yet, here God is presenting it as his greatest offer, the most valuable thing he could possibly give to us. After freeing his children from slavery, the first thing he presents them with is the covenant. And yet, according to Paul, Satan's apostle, it is something that is associated with Hagar and slavery. Hagar, of course, was an Egyptian, and yet, even though God had just freed his children from Egypt, and he had disassociated his covenant from Hagar, what does Paul say? Just the opposite. Yah established the covenant with us, as opposed to imposing it upon us, something that is also in discord with Pauline doctrine and thus Christianity. As Shaul claims that the Torah was imposed upon us, that we were under it, that it not only was a cruel taskmaster, but in Galatians, but in Romans, it is this vicious thing that ties us down and restrains us and makes us as prisoners and captives. And God yet doesn't say any of that. Covenant was forged with us. It's a partnership between us. We approach God in the covenant as his children. Never missing an opportunity to enlighten us through the meaning of his chosen names, I can't help but share the association between karat, cutting the Bereth covenant relationship, with us in Horeb, and the meaning of the root of the name Horeb, which is Hereb, meaning knife, sword, and chisel. Not only was the covenant cut at this place, that means knife, sword, and chisel, and the statements and instructions chiseled in stone in this very place on this mountain by the God who was offering this relationship to us. The place was named after the world's best known cutting implements. But in addition, and that would be knife and sword and chisel, in addition, Horeb, dry and desolate, speaks of our need for God to provide us with his covenant for us to live, for us to survive. Even here, also on Horeb, which was a dry and desolate place, remember Moshe struck the stone, the rock on Mount Horeb? Waters, living waters gushed forth. God provided the waters for us, provided the source of life. I think God conceived these word pictures hoping that we'd find them. I think that's the whole nature of the way that he communicates. He is interested in teaching those who are interested in learning. And the way we learn is by discovery. And so God provided this rich palette of etymological tools, using his words, if you will, to enlighten those of us who would seek them. Now, you aren't going to find any of this unless you're willing to invest the time. It takes effort. But if you are willing to invest the time, if you do prioritize getting to know him, and you find treasures in his word, then all along the way you will discover that God has planted word pictures for us to discover, for us to unearth, for us to evaluate, all which enable us to know him better. Hello and welcome back to Shattering Myths. We have Kathy on the line calling in from Colorado. I understand Kathy has a couple of questions. One of them is on the name of Yahowah, and the other is a question about Moses's, whose actual name is Moshe's wife. Not a question we get very often. Hello, Kathy. Welcome to the program.
Hi. Anyway, I was just wondering, because in Torah it says that his name should be Emmanuel.
No, that's not a name. Emmanuel is a title.
Oh, so then why don't we call him Emmanuel?
Because it's a title. It's not a name.
Oh, okay. Okay.
You know, and God presents his name 7,000 times in his Torah, prophets, and Psalms. When he introduces himself to Moshe, he expressly tells us that you shall tell the children of Israel that my name is Yahowah. He tells us in his Torah, prophets, and Psalms that Yahowah is my one and only name.
Okay.
And so he writes it 7,000 times that his name is Yahowah. It's his only name. A God by any other name is not God. Like, for example, Jesus can't be God because the name's not Yahowah. There's only one name that is the name of God, Yahowah. Full stop. And so it is a crying shame that our English Bible translations have followed the rabbinical edict of replacing Yahweh's name with Satan's title. Satan's title is the Lord. And so what you will find is all 7,000 times in the Torah, prophets, and Psalms when Yahowah uses or writes his name, that religious publications have replaced his name with Satan's title. the Lord.
I see.
But Emmanuel, all that means is El is God, and the first portion of that says with us. So with us is God is the title. It's just like Masayah is a title. It means Yahowah. The work of Yahweh is Masayah. There's lots of titles that are descriptive of Yahweh's nature. Now, in the case of Emmanuel, it is being applied to Yahusha because Yahusha is a corporeal manifestation of Yahweh in our presence.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so that answers that one.
Okay.
And then, like I said, I was watching the Ten Commandments, and did they introduce Moses' wife as from the tribe of Ishmael?
No. First of all, if you're watching a movie about something in the Torah, prophets, and Psalms, the likelihood of it being accurate has maybe one chance in 10 billion. For example, there isn't a single commandment among the 10 statements that were etched in stone. The imperative mood, which can convey a command, but is most often used as almost every mood in Hebrew. Hebrew has stems. There are conjugations, stems, and moods in the ascribed to Hebrew verbs. As it relates to the stems, they're all relational. They just explain the relationship between the verb and the subject and the object of the sentence. In the case of moods, they almost universally express volition. The imperative mood is the only mood in Hebrew which, in addition to expressing volition, can also express a command. There was only one of the 10 statements that was written in the imperative mood, which means there's only one of the 10 that could be considered a commandment, and it's the one where we are being encouraged to value our father and mother, and it's not our earthly father and mother, it's our heavenly father and spiritual mother that we're being asked to view as worthy and significant, and it's the only one written in the imperative mood, conveying that it would be wise of us to make the decision to properly value our Heavenly Father and spiritual mother. So there are no 10 Commandments. That whole idea of 10 Commandments is a complete misrepresentation of the 10 statements. Moshe is the Hebrew name. It's based upon Mosah. It means to draw out. His wife was an Ethiopian woman. She was black, and Aaron and Miriam thought that was a bad thing, that he choosing to fall in love and to marry a black woman was inappropriate. So Aaron and Miriam decided they would use this decision on behalf of Moshe, to oppose him. And God didn't much care for that. God turned Miriam white with leprosy and scolded Aaron, which is to say that racism does not play in God's world. If he is not racist, and he's not going to tolerate racism. And the notion that somebody would choose a wife whose skin color is different than his own does not discredit that individual from serving Yahweh as his prophet and servant. And so that's the nature of that story. We'll be back in a moment. Welcome back to Shattering Myths. We're listening to the words here of Moshe. He was God's chosen implement to work with him to draw and lead his children out of the crucible of Egypt. The crucible of Egypt is a metaphor for human religious and political oppression. God saved us from the enslavement of human institutions. It is interesting, of course, that Paul writes that the Torah is an enslaving document, and that his faith-based religion that tells us to believe in the cute little girls called the Graces, will free us from that horrible and enslaving document. It is God's position that his Torah is an expression of how he personally engaged in our lives to lead us away from the very human institutions and religious institutions, political institutions that would slave us, the very thing that Paul now has done with his religion. And so he was God's chosen implement to do this with him, because God has chosen to create the universe and create life, conceive life, for the express purpose of engaging in a relationship with man, doing things together with humankind. So this as a result means that while God could have gone into Egypt and just blasted the Pharaoh to smithereens, could have taken his people and instantly removed them through miraculous means from Goshen in northern Egypt and beamed them into Yisrael, which could have been cleansed of all religious poisons, and it could have been the perfect little spot, and he could have done all of this just with a snap of his fingers with the word of his mouth. And yet he chose not to do it that way. Now, he did have to engage and perform miracles in this particular case, which is something that's not God's normal nature. He doesn't like to show off. But he does absolutely like to work with us, which is why he chose Moshe. And you've got to laugh at his choice. This is a man that was going to speak the word of God. This was a man who was going to speak to God's children, to encourage them to follow God out of imprisonment and enslavement in Egypt. And yet Moshe was a stutterer. He picked a man that was known in Egypt to have murdered an Egyptian. Well, before he was fled to Egypt, Moshe was raised in the Pharaoh's household. Every evidence is that he grew up to be a leader within Pharaoh's household, that he was a general, fought wars in Pharaoh's household. In fact, one of the wars would have been in present-day Ethiopia. As a member of Pharaoh's household. And yet when he saw the treatment of the enslaved Israelites, and he saw an Egyptian beating an Israelite nearly to death, he intervened. And to stop the Egyptian from killing the Israelite, he ended up killing the Egyptian. And so that's why he fled. And yet God chose to take this man who was wanted for murder, who going back to Egypt would mean that unless there was a miraculous intervention, he was going to be killed. He picked a stutterer and a man wanted for murder to lead his children out of this crucible of religious and political oppression. So it's really interesting that God not only chose to use somebody, but he chose to use this man. And what had this man done for the past 40 years before God chose him? He had tended sheep. You see, when Moshe fled out of Egypt, he went to the same place that he returned the children of Israel to, this land around Mount Horeb in western Saudi Arabia, which is western Saudi Arabia today. There was no House of Saud then, but it was still the land of Arabia. And so he tended sheep. He went to the king who was over the tribe in that region and explained his story. Said, I'd like to have the opportunity to settle here and work. I'm happy to work. Given the job of tending sheep, which was perfect training for the job that he was going to have to do with the children of Israel as their shepherd, to shepherd them from enslavement in Egypt to living in the Promised Land. And so this man responsible for helping us, giving us the opportunity to listen to God, the man whereby the entire book of Devarim is Yahowah speaking through Moshe to us, he was a stutterer, deeply flawed individual. And God chose to work with him. You look at the person who is responsible for probably writing more inspired lyrics than anyone in human history would be the man known as David. His real name is Dode. It means beloved. And yet, Dode was, by human standards, a bad boy. Did lots of things that were inappropriate. At one time, he was a traitor to his country. He sent the leader of his military off to fight a battle that it was likely he would get killed in because he wanted to take his wife because he thought she was cute. He built a harem, therefore was, by every standard, adulterous. He did lots of things that were inappropriate. And, for example, the move that he made because he coveted his general's wife, God took him to task for. And it severely crippled what Dode could do during his mortal existence. And yet, Dode, as an imperfect individual, came to know Yahowah, came to love Yahowah, came to respect what Yahowah was offering, capitalized on what Yahowah was offering, and became the most enlightened spokesperson the world has ever known in terms of sharing Yahowah's testimony with us. He's the one who wrote the songs that tell us how to go about observing the Torah. When you read his 119th Psalm, which is 22 stanzas long because there's 22 letters in the Hebrew alphabet, and he goes through with the meaning of each of those 22 letters and creates 8 lyrics associated with each letter. The entire song is written to tell us how you go about observing the Torah. And there isn't a single rule specified in it. There's not a single concept in here as to what you have to do. It's all about the process of listening, of observing, of contemplating, of understanding, and then responding. That's how we go about observing the Torah. And so here you have God telling us through the choice of these two men that it isn't our behavior that endears us to God. It isn't our behavior which determines whether or not we can engage in a relationship with God or that we are saved by that relationship. God did not write his Torah for perfect men, despite what Paul writes. The Torah does not have to be obeyed perfectly for one to benefit from it. In fact, just the opposite. The Torah was written to guide imperfect men to God's home, so that we, as imperfect and flawed individuals, can live with him and be perfected by him. The Torah's purpose is the antithesis of the way Christians interpret it. It is all about imperfect people being given the opportunity to be perfected by God so that we can engage in a relationship with him. And the very fact that Moshe and Dode were imperfect and flawed individuals underscores this. The more flawed they were, the more we are forced to recognize that it isn't our behavior. It isn't obedience to a set of rules that determine whether or not we are viewed as righteous in God's eyes or not. But instead, it is his formula. The terms and conditions of his covenant and the benefits of his covenant that make that determination. The Torah is guidance for flawed individuals like Dode, like Moshe, like me, like you, to be able to walk away from politics and religion and our corruption and rebellion of God, against God, so that he can make us immortal, perfect us, adopt us into his family, enrich us, and empower us. That's why it exists. So as we move on to the next statement, still speaking of the covenant, Moshe, who is now inspired to speak for God, God using a flawed implement even in speech, a man who said that his tongue was thick. In other words, he had the same problem that I have from time to time. He was not the most articulate spokesperson in the world. He said, Yahowah is not cutting this familial covenant relationship with our fathers, but rather instead with those of us here who are living on this day. Now, what does that mean? Does that mean that it's a different covenant relationship? No, because there's no difference stated at all. The covenant that is being cut with them is identical to the covenant that was cut with Abraham, which was affirmed with Yishak, which means laughter, the first child of the covenant. Tells you all about the covenant. Yishak means laughter. Or with Jacob. Jacob is a really interesting name relative to the covenant because Jacob speaks of one who really digs in his heels, who supplants his heels, who walks in a way that's steadfast, digs in, says, I'm not going to waver from you. You're not going to pull me off to the side. I'm not going to wander astray. When you really walk firmly with purpose, you dig in your heels. That's what Jacob means. That's what Yahowah is saying here. There's no difference in this covenant. It's identical. So the difference is that the way that the covenant works is it's cut with each of us where we are, when we are. So your invitation to participate in this covenant is as personal, as vital, as real, as was Abraham's, as was Yishak's, as was Jacob's, as were the children of Israel on that day, some 3,500 years ago. It's one of the reasons that Hebrew verbs are not stuck in time. They're always true. What he's telling us here is that Yahowah is ever ready, no matter where we are, no matter when we live, no matter who we are, and no matter our skin color, no matter our gender, no matter our age, no matter our position in life. He is ever ready to cut us into his covenant relationship with all of us who are living on this day. Welcome back to Shattering Myths. We're in our last segment, but we'll be back here with you again tomorrow. We have a caller from Philadelphia. His name is Glenn, and I understand he has a number of questions. Glenn, welcome to the program.
Hello. Good morning, Yada. I understand your stance on the Apostle Paul, or Shaul, as you call him. I'm curious also, but I'm also curious about what exactly. I don't get to hear you with great regularity. I'm curious as to what your doctrine is about the man that Christians refer to as Jesus Christ, and then also perhaps you could. I'm also curious about what your stance is on the notion that life is in the blood, and that without the shedding of blood, there's no remission of sin. Those are two questions I'm thinking about.
Okay. First, it's not that I call him Shaul. That's his name. He was born as Shaul, and it's important to know that he was born as Shaul because one of the most powerful prophecies that God ever shared with us is a prophecy specifically about the man named Shaul, where God says that his words are the plague of death. And so it's very important that you know that his name is Shaul, and that what Shaul means, which is to question him. And in fact, in that prophecy, God speaking to Christians saying, why is it that you're unwilling to question him? And so it is important that we know that his given name was Shaul. It's also important that we know that his chosen name was Paulos, which means lowly and little, because Yahusha specifically told us that a man whose name would mean lowly and little would be the wolf in sheep's clothing that would lead us away from the Torah and therefore many to their death. So it is really important to know about Shaul, about Paulos. One of the things that I have done regarding that, though, for those who can't regularly listen to the program, is I have written a book called Questioning Paul. It is available at questioningpaul.com for free. I am in the process of rewriting the book because I've learned so much over these last 3 or 4 years since I originally wrote the book, and so my recommendation would be to wait a couple of months before reading it, because the rewrite of it is tenfold more effective than was the original, although the original is more than overwhelming in terms of the evidence brought against Paul. Now, as it relates to the person known by Christians as Jesus Christ, there was no one named Jesus Christ in the first century of the Common Era. The first person whose name could even incorporate the J sound didn't exist until the 17th century. That's when the letter J was first invented to convey that hard sound. So no one named Jesus. There is no basis for Jesus even in the so-called Christian New Testament. Even Iusu, Iusus, Iusun are not written out on any page of any eyewitness or historical account of Yahushua's, which is his real name, life. Divine placeholders were used instead in the manner of the Septuagint, which were done because you can't actually transliterate, which means to replicate the sound accurately of Yahushua's name using the Greek letters.
I understand the significance of the linguistics in the language, but what I mean is that in terms of the actual person himself, do you believe that
Yes, yeah. But if you don't understand the name and the correction of the name, then there's no way to understand who the person was, because it's his name that explains who he is, and it's his title, which, by the way, Christ is not a last name. It's not even an accurate translation of the Hebrew title Messiah. When you understand what his actual name is and what his actual title is, then the question is answered as to who he is and what he was doing. And so there is nothing more important than actually understanding that his actual name is Yahushua, because Yahushua explains who he is and what he was doing. Yahushua means Yahweh saves. It means Yahweh saves. What is God's name?
Yahweh.
Yeah, Yahowah is God's name. If you look at the way that the Hebrew vowels Yod, He, and Wah are pronounced in some 10,000 words that Yahweh used to comprise his Torah, prophets, and Psalms, you'll find that Yahowah is the only applicable way to pronounce those three vowels. But since Yahweh is God's one and only name, and the name Yahushua means Yahweh saves, it answers the question who he is, and it answers the question of what he was doing. It was Yahweh saving us. That's also what Messiah conveys, because Messiah is the work of Yah. Glenn, I would love for you to call back tomorrow during our first hour or at any other time, but we're out of time for today. But please call back. I'd love to address your questions.